From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We start today with an update on the coronavirus, the story that has dominated the news all week long. For where things stand right now, we welcome now Drew Armstrong. And Drew, I want to start with this change that CDC has made to the way that state and local entities can do their testing. What's the significance of this?
Yeah, so one of the big questions that's been going on in the minds of health authorities at the state, local, and federal level is, we know about a handful of cases that have been found from people who returned from China, but the real big mystery has been, is this virus circulating in the United States in some areas, regions, or nationally? It's a very mild virus in most people. And so you're wondering, is this thing out there and we just don't know it yet? They've been limited in their ability to find that out because there hasn't been widespread kind of surveillance level testing, and all these tests many of them have had to be sent to the CDC to be confirmed, and really limited to people who have a travel history in China and are showing symptoms. Last night, for the first time, we got news that a patient without any of those ties to China or a known patient had been diagnosed. That is a first, and it is a suggestion that this virus might be in wider circulation. Now, the test that has been out there, they have not been able to get this thing working in many places. The CDC is going to allow it to be modified so that more state and local public health labs can do that type of work when someone has symptoms that might be this virus. It could also be the cold or the flu, but you want to start doing that broad surveillance, looking for patients that you might not find otherwise.
So we saw China change their methodology 2 or 3 times over there in Hubei province. Is there any risk here that changing this methodology will get some false positives, or in fact we may contaminate the data?
Yeah, I think the worry always with tests like this is that you want to be accurate. You want to know that when you say someone has a disease, that they do have it. The way the current test works is essentially it looks at the genetic material of the virus and essentially tests it 3 different ways. And if all 3 of those are positive, then that's a positive test. You can take down those number of steps. You may lose some accuracy in doing so. I mean, remember, coronaviruses, milder forms of them can cause a common cold. We've seen many, many forms of this thing. And so what you don't want to do is start getting false positives. What they're saying in this case, though, is that we need to start doing this type of work and able to potentially flag more of these people. They're going to loosen the criteria in these tests, use 2 criteria instead of 3, and try to get the surveillance working more effectively.
We heard from President Trump late yesterday, in a news conference in which he admitted that it's possible it could spread in the United States, but he seemed to be downplaying the risk to some extent, saying it was fairly modest, he thought. At the same time, his CDC people keep saying, no, it's a really great risk. Is there a true difference there, or is it just an emphasis?
I think one of the things that's important to remember here is that the risk to an individual person, you or I or anybody else, is really, really low. I mean, there are only a few cases of this. People who do get it, the rate of severe cases is a small percentage. The rate of fatalities is probably somewhere under 2%. As an individual disease for me to worry about or you to worry about, it is not particularly scary. As a societal disease, impact, things like that, it seems to be comparable with something like the flu, where you have, tens of thousands of patients who may die of the disease every year in hospitals. That is a meaningful impact. That is a real, if you look at the broad impact on society, that is a plague that we have to grapple with. We've just become normalized to it.
Okay, Drew, thank you so very much. That's Drew Armstrong, who reports for us on healthcare. And now we want to check in on how the markets are doing in response to, let's be fair, the coronavirus. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So we're down again today.
We are. Another down day, the 6th down day for the S&P 500 in a row. Official correction down more than 10%. However, right now we are off the low. So investors really searching for a bottom. What you want to see in a situation like this is a capitulation bottom. The old saying, take the stairs up, the elevator down. That's especially true in this particular case. So when you take the elevator down, you need to see that capitulation bottom where all of the fear is washed out and the buyers come in very quickly. It felt a little bit like that fearful selling earlier today, but we haven't quite seen the buying yet. Typically, you'd want to see it faster. Let's watch into the close. And plus, in periods of volatility like this, you can have big down days by big up days, which could be followed by big down days. Lots of volatility. It seems like there's more work to the downside to be done as investors grapple with what this will mean.
What else should we be looking at? Is it bonds? bonds? Is it the VIX? What else are you watching?
You know, it's a real combination of all of these asset classes. You know, we've been watching the commodity complex, oil in particular, less liquid, which was selling off well ahead of stocks because investors using that as a gauge of the economic global growth. We've also been watching the Dow Transports. The Dow Transports comprise of a lot of those airline stocks, some of them in bear markets. American Airlines over the last 5 days, I believe, is down 25%. That's pretty extraordinary. So if you start to see some sort of a bounce in the airlines, that may suggest that traders, investors think that global travel is going to be less stymied by the coronavirus. That could be some sort of a bottom. But that Dow Transports well below its 200-day moving average. Today, the S&P 500 testing its 200-day moving average. Past trading history suggests that the S&P 500 could follow for a continued drop below that 200-day moving average. It seems like there is perhaps more work, again, to be done to the downside. And all of this before the coronavirus does have some sort of a meaningful impact here in the U.S. We're already seeing numbers cut, global economic growth cut, really impacting the financial markets.
We want to focus on the United States right now, but thank you so much, Abigail Doolittle, for that report on the markets. We're going to go now to Capitol Hill and welcome Senator Mike Braun, Republican of Indiana, who serves on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, as well as on the Budget Committee. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. You are in Washington. We heard from President Trump late yesterday. What is your assessment from what you know, what you've been briefed on, about where we are with respect to the United States and the coronavirus?
So most of us were briefed, if you attended on Tuesday, in the top secret meeting. And to be honest, I was impressed that from the Department of Homeland Security, CDC, NIH, FDA, we're as prepared as any country can be. And I think what's bothered me most is how it's been sensationalized in a political way. I believe in a real way, we need to take this for what it is. I think it's going to be one of maybe several instances that we might confront over time. It's going to say, do you have the infrastructure? Do you have the institutions to deal with it? And David, my real concern would be if I were the Chinese government, where it all started, to where the carnage economically and in lives lost is going to be hard to measure, and it's got to have them reeling. In our case, we take it for what it is, something that's got a lot of unknown variables to it, but I believe we're as well prepared as any country in the world to deal with it, and it's shameful that Chuck Schumer does his shuffle like he does on many issues to politicize it.
So as far as the United States goes, because I want to come back to China in a moment, but as far as the United States goes, as far as what you've seen, you believe that we can contain it realistically?
We are going to be better at that than any country because we've got the infrastructure to do it. And so far, we've had very few cases outside of the cruise ship individuals that, thank goodness, are back here in the homeland. But I think what has surprised me most, I guess it shouldn't, I've been here just a little over a year, any issue has a political angle put to it. And I think what Chuck Schumer did in this case is kind of shameful because he wasn't at that briefing that I recalled back on Tuesday. He was out at the microphone or on the floor making statements to me that didn't make sense. I think what the president has done, assigning Vice President Pence as a point person for this, but mostly the institutions, the infrastructure we've got in place, lets us deal with this as good as any other place.
As I understand it, under the Trump administration, that infrastructure has been changed some. And for example, there's a person at NSC, the National Security Council, who was let go, was not replaced. There's some other people who have not been replaced. Are you confident that we have the people in place in the infrastructure going down from the White House on down to Department of Homeland Security and other places who can handle something if it does become more of an epidemic in the United States?
I do. And I think whenever you look at personnel changes that have been cited as maybe making us not prepared, again, I think that's got a strong political smell to it. And these institutions that I mentioned earlier have been around for a long time. And I think that's where you'll see the difference. On the other hand, this is unknown in terms of the extrapolation of what happens. But I think we're going to get through it. And I think in containing it, and when it comes to like the vaccine that we're talking about, that'll be done here. They're much quicker than what they used to be, and we'll all learn from it. And sadly, I think with the kind of economy we've got now, we'll have stuff like this originate in places that we'll have to deal with down the road. And I think this is a good heads up for us and the world to maybe sharpen our skills with it.
We're talking to Senator Mike Braun, Republican of Indiana. I want to go to exactly where you just pointed us, which is the supply chain issue. Those have already come under some stress because of some trade tensions. But as a result of this, there really are some questions about disruption of supply chains coming out of China. As a practical matter, is it likely this is going to change our relations, our commercial relations around the world in the longer term?
I think it definitely will. When you take what we've had to deal with China in forced technology transfers, the IP issues, currency manipulations, creating these gluts and dumping them, with the tariffs, I don't like tariffs, but I think the president was correct. We would not have gotten their attention. And this, along with the African swine fever on their pork supply, this is probably more devastating to China than any of what we grappled with them to try to change their behavior. And yes, the companies that have gone deeply into China with their supply chain, I'm sure, are looking at what they do to spread their eggs into other baskets, hedge their bets. That'll be the true cost to the Chinese, and I think they're going to have a lot of soul searching to do about how they react to it once we get through the hysteria of the moment.
And Senator, finally, you know business terribly well. You run a successful business.
Yep.
What about the possible knock-on effects in the consumer confidence aspect? Because some people have said, even beyond the direct effects on supply chains and things, if the consumers, particularly American consumer, gets concerned, stops spending on some discretionary things, it could hit our economy.
So that is where I have more confidence. The consumer is savvy, and they've been part of, as a consumer, with household incomes that have gone up $5,000 a family since Trump has been here versus $1,000 from the stretch of Bush through Obama over 16 years. This economy on Main Street is hotter than it's ever been. That's what's been driving the market. That's why I think we'll get some of the market back. There will be real economic loss that we won't get back, but I think the consumer knows this is an outlier, it's an aberration, and has confidence in our country, in the infrastructure we got to get through it, and they'll be watchful, but I think it's not going to disrupt in general what's been set into place back in 2016 with the Jobs and Tax Cut Act. All of that is driving the economy here better than any other place in the world.
Senator, really appreciate your time, as always. That's Senator Mike Braun, Republican of Indiana, coming to us from Capitol Hill. And we turn now to Mark Crumpton. He is here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, Japan will close schools nationwide to help control the spread of the coronavirus. The government said today all schools will remain shut until spring holidays begin in late March. The measure affects nearly 13 million students at about 35,000 schools. Japan now has almost 900 cases of coronavirus, including 705 from a quarantine cruise ship. Russia wants its last remaining nuclear treaty with the United States to be extended. Russia says there's no time left to negotiate any changes to the New START treaty that expires in February of 2021. The pact, which was signed in 2010 by former President Obama and then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, limits each country to no more than 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads and 700 deployed missiles and bombers. Demonstrators gathered for a fourth consecutive day on two Greek islands to protest government plans to build new migrant detention centers. Lesbos and Chios are the main entry points for tens of thousands of people seeking better lives in the European Union. But long delays in the asylum process and increased migrant flows have led to severe overcrowding in the island camps. Residents want migrants moved to the mainland. Nearly 6,600 pedestrians were killed in the United States in 2019, the highest number in 30 years. That's according to new reports by the Governor's Highway Safety Association. One potential reason is cell phone use. The report says the number of devices in active use in the U.S. has ballooned by more than 400% in the past 10 years. The report also says alcohol is also a major factor. About a third of the pedestrians killed were legally drunk. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. 2 days until the South Carolina primary, and we hear from an expert from the College of Charleston, who's Professor Jordan Ragusa. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
It isn't a question of the American people deciding that we have too much gun violence. Everyone.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. 2 more days until South Carolina's primary, and a new poll out this morning from Monmouth University shows former Vice President Biden still holds a substantial lead over his opponents. It's a commanding 20 points more than his next closest candidate, that is Senator Bernie Sanders. Welcome now, Associate Professor and Associate Chair of Political Science at the College of Houston. He's Jordan Ragusa, and he's coming to us on the telephone today. So, Professor, thank you for joining us. Give us your sense of where we are in South Carolina, looking forward to this Democratic primary.
Yeah, so this is certainly a key moment in the primary. Of course, we had the debate in Charleston on Tuesday, and yesterday, Representative Jim Clyburn, the number 3rd ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives, endorsed Joe Biden. And as you mentioned at the start, there's a new Monmouth University poll out that shows Biden in a commanding lead. So, if Biden can parlay the endorsement and the good debate performance into Saturday, he seems like he's the odds-on favorite to win the South Carolina primary. And then the question becomes, how does he do in the Super Tuesday states that are located largely in the South on March 3rd?
So, as you say, Representative Clyburn's endorsement in the past in South Carolina has meant an awful lot to any Democrat running down there in the primary. Do we have any sense of whether that still is the case, that endorsements count that much, or have things changed? Because there's some erosion of some party discipline.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, one of the things that we did in the book is we looked at endorsements over time from 1988 to the present, and what we find is that they do, in fact, matter. Candidates that do well securing endorsements prior to the primary get a noticeable bump in their performance on Election Day. When it comes to Clyburn, I mean, he is sort of unique in a lot of ways. I mean, there's probably no other politician in this state on either side of the aisle that has his clout. It's why the candidates work so hard to secure Clyburn's endorsement. So I think that it matters. How much it matters is really difficult to put an estimate on. So, for example, that Monmouth University poll that just came out today, it wasn't in the field at the time that Clyburn had endorsed. So this Biden 20-point lead that they're showing doesn't even have Clyburn's endorsement factored in yet. We really won't know until Election Day how much it's worth, but there's no doubt that it matters for a lot.
Professor Ragusa just referred to a book that he's co-authored. It's called First in the South, Why South Carolina's Presidential Primary Matters. We want to make sure you know about that book from Professor Ragusa. Let me ask about South Carolina's primary in a different way. In the past, there have been some reports of some, one might say, political dirty tricks in South Carolina. I remember, for example, some played on John McCain a few years back as a practical matter. And this year we have reports about an ad that was taken out, as I understand it, using President Barack Obama's voice in a way that appeared to disparage Vice President Biden, something that President Obama actually came out and denounced. He ordered them to cease and desist. Is this a tradition in South Carolina? What's going on down there?
It does seem to be a tradition in South Carolina. I mean, one of the things that people debate on this issue is whether it's something that's unique to the demographics or politics of South Carolina. And I think that that's really not the case. I mean, South Carolina is in such a pivotal position on the calendar that really it's make or break in ways that Iowa and New Hampshire aren't. Of course, we still have a large field that's vying for the Democratic nomination. We don't have a Republican contest, of course, this year. And so there are a few candidates whose survival depends on a good performance in South Carolina. And so I think that really incentivizes them to go dirty. And so, that's something that we've seen in past contests. I think it's something that we'll see in future contests.
And Professor, I'm also curious about the polling down there, because there have been some instances in the past where particularly some Democratic candidates have done much better than the polls indicated, some suggestion that maybe they tend to underreport maybe older African-American voters. That happened perhaps in the case of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I've not seen any hard data on whether that's the case or not, but it certainly seems like it would be true. The larger thing is that primaries and caucuses are just very fluid electoral environments. In general elections, we have reliable data on how people are going to vote. We can better estimate things like turnout, which is much higher in a general election than it is in a primary. And of course, party ID is such a strong factor in general elections. Since all these people are Democrats, you don't have the party ID to distinguish between the candidates. So I think the bigger thing is just that primaries and caucuses are really fluid. A lot of voters are still making up their minds. It's a reason why strong debate performances matter so much. It's a reason why endorsements matter. It's a reason why media attention is such a critical component of the campaign.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much for your time today. Really helpful. That is Professor Jordan Ragusa of the College of Charleston. Still ahead, we're continuing to cover markets. Stocks are sliding again, but are now well off their lows of the day. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Getting back to the markets now, stocks are falling for the 6th consecutive day. Bloomberg's Kaylee Alliance is joining me now with more. And in fairness, though, they're off of how low they were today, so a little better.
Right. If you're an equity investor, that's maybe a bit of good news. We're no longer down 3%. That said, we're still down pretty hard, more than 1.5% for all three major averages. And the S&P is tested with some pretty key levels. The 200-day moving average, we're flirting with correction territory for the S&P and the Dow, so it's still not pretty. And of course, you're seeing volatility up as well. And I think what the market really is trying to price here is whether or not it's time to buy the dip is, of course, the big question. But also, how is the headline risk different from what is the actual fundamental picture? Because we're getting company after company warning about the impact the virus is going to have on the bottom line. One of them lately is Microsoft, which scrapped its forecast. And remember, Microsoft is what had really been leading the rally while we were still having one, along with the likes of Apple, which already has warned about the virus. You're starting to see the companies, the big ones that were leading this market, warning, and they're taking down the market today. They're all down about 3%.
And it feels like every day we have one or two more of them. And actually, There's a report on the Bloomberg right now about the Kansas City Fed District now reporting that 40% of the manufacturers they polled said they will have negative effects from coronavirus. So that's across the heartland.
Right, and it's not just the industrial sector. I mean, this is in tech, this is in retail, this is all across the board. And you're having strategists now, the likes of David Kostin over at Goldman Sachs, saying we're not going to see any earnings growth for S&P 500 companies this year. Now, that's a pretty drastic prediction. If you're a fundamental equity investor, it's really hard to make the case to buy the dip here when you aren't going to see profit growth this year. So I think that's what equity investors are contending with. And then, of course, you're seeing a continued bid then out of equities into the likes of bonds. The 10-year yield hit 125 today. I mean, the bid just
interest rates go lower, so the equities do a little bit better, actually.
In theory.
That's the theory. Okay. Many thanks now to Bloomberg's Kaylee Alliance for that report on the markets. Up next, we see what the coronavirus is doing to the equity markets, but what is it going to do to the global economy? We ask Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute. This is Balance of Power. We are on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, U.S. health officials are taking steps to expand coronavirus testing across the country. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration say they will allow state and local health labs to modify a test for the virus that has been plagued by weeks of delays. The change should speed testing and allow labs to begin using hundreds of kits that were sent out earlier this month rather than wait for a new version to be sent. Vice President Pence has selected the State Department's top AIDS official to join the coronavirus response team. Deborah Birx was nominated by former President Obama in 2014 as the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator to oversee humanitarian aid programs combating the epidemic. She also served as head of the Global HIV/AIDS Division at the CDC. President Trump announced Wednesday that Pence would lead the administration's response to the coronavirus. Australian Timothy Weeks, who was held captive for 3 years by the Taliban, is in Qatar for the signing of a peace deal between the U.S. and the Taliban. Weeks was abducted in Kabul in 2016 while working as a professor at the American University of Afghanistan, along with American Kevin King. Weeks says he was invited to Saturday's signing ceremony by the Taliban. The plan to add a third runway at London's Heathrow Airport faces more delays. Environmentalists won a court appeal over an expansion at Europe's busiest airport. Heathrow says it needs the extra runway to compete with rival hubs. Opponents say the government hasn't taken into account the impact of climate change. The airport says it will appeal. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. At first, we were told that the reaction to the coronavirus would be likely short, limited to the first quarter and with a V-shaped recovery. But it's not looking that way anymore. To give us an expert economist perspective, we welcome now Mary Lovely. She is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and Professor of Economics at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us today. You're not a fortune teller, you're an economist, but give us your best assessment. How does an economist go about figuring out what is the analogy here? What should we expect from the coronavirus?
Well, obviously, no one knows where this is going, so we have to have a range of estimates. Right now, those estimates are pretty wide. They could be anywhere from 100 billion to 1.1 trillion, depending on whether this virus stays mainly contained in China or becomes a pandemic. Each day that we find new outbreaks, new clusters of the virus, we have to say we're heading more toward the upside in terms of the losses to the global economy.
And is this a different kind of crisis in that it hits both supply and demand? We've got the supply chain problem, but also we've got people not buying things because they're confined to quarters, as it were.
Yes. The economist Olivier Blanchard, who's here at the Peterson Institute, former chief economist for the IMF, has reminded people that the largest economic losses will be from, he believes, on the demand side, which of course have an impact on the supply side. But let's just think about what happens when we have to close a school. Parents are unable to get to their jobs, or when people are afraid to take subways, which are, of course, one of the lifebloods of American cities. People will stop purchasing personal services, entertainment, tourism. As we've seen in China, these costs can mount very quickly.
And so what sectors do you look at first? I mean, obviously, travel is being hit pretty hard, it would appear, around the world. We also hear some things about things like restaurants, discretionary consumer spending, things like that.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to see it in all these services. What we've seen in terms of supply chains, the first order effect has been on things like auto parts, furniture and fixtures, so building supplies. We've seen it in pharmaceutical chemicals, so things that China is a huge supplier to the rest of the world for. Within the Chinese economy, however, there's been a huge slowdown within the service sector. Many of those are small, very small companies, family-owned businesses, and I think we'll see a lot of people having to close their businesses, urban unemployment as a result of that. However, it's very possible that China is turning the corner, and those losses will start to mount up in new sites, particularly right now we're seeing in South Korea and increasingly in Italy. This week alone, Syracuse University is pulling its students out of Florence, as is Stanford University, NYU. That's just the beginning of the type of exodus that we will see from sites that are hit by COVID-19.
We're talking with Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute. What can be done about it? Particularly, what can governments do about it besides obviously trying to do the public health issues that we all are addressing? Will monetary policy help this? We're all looking to the Fed. We're hanging on every word they say. They said they're still studying it. But is this something that monetary policy can even help with?
Well, you know, stimulating the economy after the worst part of the virus is always going to be very important. China's already announcing spending plans in each of its major cities, so fiscal policy as well as monetary. Monetary authorities have been warning us for a long time. There's very little policy space. Interest rates are already extremely low. We're seeing them go lower as we see a flight toward U.S. treasuries. And so it's going to have to be two hands. There's going to have to be a fiscal stimulus as well if this virus continues to spread to other parts of the world.
Even if there isn't much ammunition or the tools left in the toolbox, whatever analogy you want to use, it's not keeping the markets from already discounting in more Fed cuts.
Yes, and that's certainly something that we are likely to see. There is a little bit of policy space. I think the question is, will it be enough? The Chinese, who are, of course, were on the front line on this, have said that they will maintain their projected growth rate, which would be anywhere between 5.8 and 6%. But that is going to require a rather large stimulus. It's going to add to debt problems that already exist. And it's going to be difficult on firms. As you said, even if workers get back in place, there's still the issue of lost demand, which will never be recovered. People don't go see, movies or eat restaurant meals that they hadn't eaten last week. And it'll take some time for people to have the confidence to get back out there into the shopping malls and the restaurants and the movie theaters.
And finally, Professor, what is the risk that there could be further damage done to the notion of globalization? Already it was having a bit of a rocky time with all the trade disputes going on. Is there a prospect that perhaps people will change their supply chains permanently and say, look, I don't want to run this risk again, at least not to this degree?
That's a very interesting question. I think we're going to learn a lot from this episode. We have been studying the China-U.S. trade war to see what had happened there. We did see flex in the supply chains, where companies that had factories in multiple different locations were able to shift production from one location to another. That is possible as long as the virus is constrained. Once the virus moves, though, it appears that basically no location is really, quote unquote, safe. And in that sense, it's very difficult to see how, a CEO will think, oh, just moving operations out of China will make me safe. To the extent that this becomes a global phenomenon, I really hate to use the word pandemic, but if it does become a pandemic, it's not clear that it will disadvantage any one particular country, because it will just argue, in a sense, for diversification.
Okay, Professor, really appreciate your time. It's very helpful today. That's Mary Lovely. She's Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Coming up, are we living in a decadent society? That's the thesis of Ross Douthat's new book. He's here to take us through why he thinks that and what it could mean for us all. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Change has become a commonplace, with what seems like a revolution in technology and politics and society coming with what feels like increasing rapidity. But New York Times columnist Ross Douthat has taken a fresh look at the developing world over the last 50 years and concluded that it's an illusion, that what feels like evolution bordering on revolution is actually closer to running around in a circle, albeit maybe faster and faster. He's written about it in his new book, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. And we welcome him now. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's terrific to be here.
So one of the great things about this book is it specifically dates when we became a decadent society. And it was when I was watching, I'm old enough to remember, watching a man land on the moon. That was it. That was the apex.
So that is sort of the convenient peak that I start with. And the argument in the book is that basically if you go back to 1969 and trace the developed world forward from there, you get economic deceleration, sort of trending towards stagnation, where you go from 5 or 6% growth to 2% growth. You get technological stagnation everywhere except the tech world, right? So obviously, iPhones, communications, virtual reality, we've had real innovation there, but energy, transportation, a whole host of other things haven't delivered what people expected. And then you have a world of declining birth rates. Western societies are getting older. Our politics, I think this part of decadence everyone can recognize. They're stalemated and gridlocked and don't work particularly well. And then this is maybe the more subjective thing, but I think there's been repetition too. The fact that we are here in 2020 with our big blockbuster movie being essentially a remake of Return of the Jedi, right, as the last Star Wars movie basically was, suggests that we're sort of still living in the cultural world that the baby boomers made. So it's not collapse or crisis, but it's not quite the future that we were promised 50 years ago.
But to indulge me as a baby boomer,
yes,
so I was in high school.
Fine generation.
I was in high school in 1960. When you go back to 1969, it didn't feel like a very good time. I mean, we'd assassinated a president, we assassinated a would-be president in Robert Kennedy, we assassinated a civil rights legend, we were burning our cities, we were marching in the streets against a very unpopular war in Asia. It felt like the whole society was falling apart, not that we were reaching an apex.
Right, and this is, I mean, one of the points I make in the book is that there is actually a case for decadence, in the sense that a decadent society is more, because it's older and a little more stagnant, it's a little more stable, a little less violent, a little safer than the world that you came of age in. So if you look back at the 60s, they're a time of dynamism and danger at the same time. They're an era when you can have transformative political reform and also 2,000 terrorist bombings like there were in the U.S. from 1971 to 72. So it's not that we should look at decadence and say, this is the end of the world and things have just gotten worse. It's more that they've gotten safer but also less creative, right? So an example from the world of teenagers, right? So teenagers now have safer lives, certainly, than they did when you were a kid. And even when I was a kid, they're less likely to drive drunk, less likely to have sex early, less likely to get pregnant, less likely to use drugs. They're more likely to be on their phones, more likely to be playing video games. They're also more likely to be depressed, anxious, and suicidal. And then, as far as we can tell, they may also be less likely to form relationships, get married, and have kids. So this is the trade-off of decadence. It makes us safer and calmer, but also maybe less creative, dynamic, and sometimes less happy.
I wonder also if a part of your thesis depends on what is the denominator you pick, because you pick the developed world.
Yes.
Basically. If you take the world overall, another way to look at what's happened actually is sort of a north to south transfer.
Yep.
That in fact there's more of an evening out than there was back in 1969 between the haves and the have-nots globally.
Yes.
And that may not be a bad thing for the world.
Right, and one of the points I make is that decadence, as I describe it, is a Western Europe, United States, and to some extent Pacific Rim, Japan, South Korea phenomenon. It has not been, you might describe the Middle East right now as, chaotic and convulsing. You wouldn't call it decadent. China's growth rate over the last 25 years, certainly not decadent, right? So there's been this convergence of rising powers with a stagnating West. I think the question is there someone who's poised to leapfrog the West? Is China really going to sort of blast past us and lead the world into a Pacific century? Or is there something about decadence that's actually the destination that a lot of these, even countries like that were supposed to be growing rapidly, Turkey and South Africa, have stagnated a bit the closer they've gotten to the West.
You mentioned political transformation, I think you said. Many people would say that Donald J. Trump is a form of political transformation. We've not seen his like before. So, do you agree with that?
Yes and no. Trump he's clearly someone who is, in certain ways, decadent himself, obviously, but is also sort of a rebel against decadence. Make America Great Again is a slogan that basically says the future was supposed to be better, and we need to get back to the future that was promised. So in that sense, he's he's a different and novel figure. But look at the Trump era in terms of actual policy making. It's pretty barren. You've had one big tax cut that's sort of a version of what George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan would have done. But all the things that Trump promised, the massive new infrastructure program, the amazing, beautiful Obamacare replacement, haven't happened. And what Trump has mostly delivered is a lot of energy and fodder for people in our line of work, right, to argue about. And I think that's sort of the dynamic you see with Bernie Sanders maybe too, right?
I was going to ask, is there a subconscious desire for the society to have something that at least appears to be revolutionary, like a Donald Trump or like a Bernie Sanders?
Absolutely. People are discontented with sort of stagnant prosperity, and they want something different and better to some extent, but then they also are cautious and like the programs that they have and don't want them to change. So you see this repeating pattern in the Western world where you have populist rebellions, and then the populists come to power and they may not actually know what to do with the power, and sort of the forces of stalemate reassert themselves. So it's totally possible to imagine Bernie Sanders winning and then governing not that differently from the way Joe Biden would, even though Biden is the candidate of sustainable decadence and Bernie is the candidate of revolution.
Is China decadent? Because if you take that same time horizon back to '69, China has been growing economically in all sorts of ways, innovations. As you say, we've basically been stagnating.
Yes.
Is China decadent right now?
It has not you wouldn't say that about China over the last 30 years. You would say that they're not decadent. The question for China that's getting a really strong test at the moment is whether they basically have a ceiling on their progress where they're going to end up starting to stagnate. So you've seen over the last 5 or 10 years, their amazing growth rates have, settled down a bit. They're not growing quite as fast as South Korea and Japan did at the same period. And their population, because of the one-child policy, but for other reasons as well, they have the same demographic issues that the Western world does. And now they're getting an incredible test of the stability of their system. So I think in 5 or 10 years, we'll know more about whether China joins us in decadence or something more dramatic happens.
And we didn't get to demographics and fertility. Next time. You got to come back. We'll talk about fertility next time.
I'll
That's
be
also
back
in the book.
after the coronavirus.
In the book. There you go. Okay. Many thanks to Ross Douthat. He is New York Times columnist and the author of The Decadent Society. We're going to have more on the markets. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for a check on the markets. Stocks are sliding a bit, less, and seem to be headed for something of a comeback, but we're going to find out from Abigail Doolittle.
Well, it's pretty interesting what we have going on today, David, because earlier when we spoke this hour, we were talking about the possibility of a capitulation bottom for stocks, because earlier in the morning, we had this huge selling, all the indexes down more than 3%, official corrections for each of the major averages. But take a look at that. The Dow Transport's now slightly higher. Now, a lot of people look past the Dow Transport's old school economy, but it's the airline, so a big tell on the coronavirus fears. Plus, they've been leading all the way down since January, at the lows down more than 15%. So that may be some ray of hope, but technically there's a lot of reasons to think that there's more work to be done to the downside.
Of course, so talk about that technical, because you follow that so closely, and we keep talking about capitulation. When we get to capitulation, how do we know?
Well, knowing, even if you ask the question, it probably hasn't happened, because typically it's such fearful, panicked selling. It just takes everybody out of by surprise, washes out all of the weak hands, and then the buying power that comes in, people don't believe it. So if you're even asking the question, or if I'm asking the question, it probably is not there yet. Relative to those technicals on the S&P 500, you're looking at 3,000, 2,900, and then the best support, quite frankly, is below 2,700. Whether or not we go there, it's hard to say. But something that's worth thinking about with this coronavirus, we have a lot of companies cutting their outlooks for sales and profits based on what's happening in Asia. We have not had meaningful cases of this coronavirus here in the U.S. based on what we're hearing this week. The CDC saying when, not if, new testing, which could show clusters. If that should happen, it could suggest not just fear in terms of selling, but also more cuts to the corporate profit outlook. It seems as though there's still too many unknowns for investors to have everything priced in, because we simply don't know what everything is at this point.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much, Abigail. Really appreciate the report on the markets. The coronavirus is reaching its tentacles into communities all around the world, as we know, and into businesses and financial markets. And now it turns out it may even be affecting U.S. relations with North Korea, as the United States announces postponement of its joint military exercises with South Korea, exercises that have exacerbated tensions with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Welcome now, Bill Ferries, who covers national security for Bloomberg in Washington. So, Bill, we've announced, as I understand, we will not have those joint exercises, in part because I believe there's some coronavirus even with U.S. troops over there.
Right. We have at least one U.S. soldier based in South Korea who's tested positive for the coronavirus. And just to, I think, keep the chances of transmission down, the U.S. and South Korea are looking at scaling back even the already limited number of joint military exercises that they've been doing the last couple of years, really, since President Trump started his outreach to Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
So it looks like we're not going to have those joint military exercises. At the same time, North Korea is a little bit distracted, as I understand it, as well. They're pretty concerned about being on the border with China.
Right. Really, they have two problems on their northern border with China and their southern border with South Korea, where there's also been a noticeable outbreak. So on both sides, and of course, North Korea is a real black hole when it comes to transparency. So the spread of the virus there is likely not to be reported very well, if it gets reported at all, and may not be something we know about till long after it happens.
So, Bill, you cover national security and particularly our military quite closely. What is the U.S. military doing about the possibility of coronavirus among their troops? As you say, we have at least one case, we believe, in South Korea. It strikes me that that could be a place where you have a lot of troops together, that you could have a lot of contagion potentially.
Right. They are trying to really limit the movement of U.S. forces, trying to keep them a little more isolated in barracks. They're trying to also limit the arrival and travel of dependents of those forces. There's about 28,000 U.S. troops in South Korea, a really large contingent, and they are quite, obviously quite cautious about having that spread through their forces and go into the military at large with people traveling between the U.S. and South Korea.
So do we have any sense of what the briefing is going on right now at the White House by our military authorities on the potential effect of coronavirus?
Well, what we know is that President Trump has put the Northern Command here in the United States in charge of coordinating the U.S. military's response to the coronavirus. So that would include everything to just making sure there's beds available for Americans who get evacuated back to the U.S., for instance, from the cruise ship in Japan, to trying to deal with the military's role if there's a wider outbreak.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much to Bill Ferries reporting today from Washington. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn about his endorsement of Joe Biden ahead of Saturday's primary down in South Carolina. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.